Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessment. So in our last lecture, we covered global timeline from 1970 to 1999 with respect to sustainable development. We looked into particularly the environmental concerns. We looked into the initiatives that were taken at the international level and what all was really happening across the globe. So in this session, we will cover second part of the timeline from 2000 to 2021 to complete the overall global timeline from 1970 till 2021. So our coverage would be like we'll be looking at the global environmental timeline from 2000 to 2021 from the environmental perspective, and the learning outcomes is that you should be able to connect the initiatives and you see historically how different perspectives are coming in, what different initiatives are coming in, and how does our EIA currently all the enabling environment, the policies and the acts align to meet those goals at different level, from the local level to the global level, and address to all those problems. So we see that in 2001, EC directives were on place on strategic environmental assessment, SEA, of certain plans and programs which was to be implemented by the member states by 2004. So this directive was already there in place by 2001. Then we see in the same year, we see that there was a breakthrough in Bonn, where like following the Kyoto Protocol, but the breakthrough was because of the green technology by Germany, and however all the negotiations slightly happened without US. So it was not really not aligning with their country's economic best interest. So, US withdrew from this particular Bonn convention here, and the Germany had the breakthrough on the green technology. However, they came to an understanding that the need to account for the carbon sink, the natural reservoirs, which were much more efficient in terms of function of carbon sink and more efficient in terms of their absorption compared to what they release. So that was also realized, and then also considered that those the account should be taken of those calculations, estimations should be made. So in October, countries agreed on the rules for meeting targets set by the Kyoto Protocol, and then it was like channelized to enforce it. So further in 2001, we also see Doha Ministerial Declaration. And in this, the countries were encouraged to share their experiences and expertise with the members and members who are wishing to perform environmental reviews at the national level. So there was exchange of knowledge. So last time when we ended, we saw that the knowledge was also coming, the sharing of things were also coming. So now how the knowledge and experiences could be shared. So this came up in Doha Ministerial Declaration. So in 2002, we see that in the there was World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and in 2002 it marked the 10 years anniversary of United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and here the summit promoted the partnership as a non-negotiated approach to sustainability. So how all the nations could partner together. Further we see that there was global reporting initiative was formulated. and on which the guidelines were developed on how organizations should report on their economic, environmental, and social dimensions of their business activities. So, how that reporting has to be done, how that communication has to be undertaken here. So, in 2003, we see that United Nations General Assembly endorsed the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. So now you see that how we started focusing on the education component. So previously you had seen that how we were creating encouragement for awareness for people. Awareness about sustainability. So now we see that now we went on the education aspect by 2003, sharing of knowledge, creating partnership, and then education path. So in 2004, we see that there's Wangari Mutta Maathai, the founder of the Green Belt movement in Kenya. He was first environmentalist to be awarded a Nobel Prize. So that recognition for the environmental aspect was did happen here. So you see that the first time an environmentalist was awarded Nobel Prize, and it was awarded for her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. So we see that Kyoto Protocol entered into force in February 2005 after it was ratified by enough countries to account for at least 55% of the global emission. And we see that here in Kyoto Protocol, US was not included, and US was the is the world's leading carbon emitter. So European Union commits to reduce emissions by 8% in Kyoto Protocol below 1990 levels. Japan commits to 5%, and Russia committed to keeping levels steady with 1990 levels. Between 2008 and 2012, even the protocol is set to expire. Was set to expire. Countries are supposed to reduce emissions by their pledged amounts. In 2005, we see Millennium Ecosystem Assessment (MEA) was released. Experts from 95 countries provided scientific information concerning the consequences of ecosystem change for human well-being. So what happens if that environmental loss happens, and then how we lose on these services. So that kind of assessment was undertaken, and the framework was designed. In 2005, we see that there was also evidences suggesting the increase in the frequency and severity of hurricane in the Atlantic and related storm damage, and which could be attributed to climate change. We also see that World Summit took place in New York to assess progress on Millennium Development Goals. So that time we had MDG, Millennium Development Goals, and there were proposals to modify the targets. Further, in 2005 itself, we see that RED and RED Plus convention also took place, and RED, REDD, is the abbreviation for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So that is how it is abbreviated, followed by RED Plus, with the plus referring to the role of conservation, sustainable management of forest, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks in developing countries. So how RED and RED Plus was addressing to reduction part as well as the conservation, sustainability management aspect here. So this happened in 2005, and the whole purpose was for reducing emissions from deforestations and forest degradation in the developing countries. So we see that it was negotiated under the UNFCCC since 2005, and UN RED was launched in 2008. India did not participate in it, and here in RED Plus, it defined the Bali Action Plan, and then also the COP13 was also held here. In 2017, we see that IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published its fourth assessment report on climate change. The report showed that the climate change policies are best addressed by integrating them within the broader framework of sustainable development strategies. So that all has to be integrated well. So the IPCC report indicated that. And in the same year, we also see that negotiations began for Kyoto 2.0. So before COP13 in Bali, Indonesia, the UN Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, report articulated with its strongest language. So it was emphasizing that global warming is most likely caused by human activity. So it was happening, but it was this report emphasized that it was happening because of our activity. So during the conference, discussions which took place had the stronger implications on the Kyoto Protocol. But they came to a standstill after the US objected to the widely backed proposal that calls for all industrial nations to cut down greenhouse gas emissions by specific targets. So US didn't agree to that. So the key argument, US officials argued that developing countries must also make commitments. So US wanted the developing countries also to have their commitment in place. So they had to leave this. US had to withdraw from here. We see in 2008, a global food price increase happened, like it was 43% in 1 year. And there was also growing energy demand in People's Republic of China, India, and elsewhere, which also increased the energy prices. And then the financial institutions were failing, and then there was failure of the mortgage lending in United States as well. And there were problems in the market. Then also there was recession, what we see in 2008. So that started happening here, and then at the same time we see the notion of green economy also coming into the mainstream, and then the low carbon economy and green growth became new objectives. So how we were aligning ourselves with the low carbon economy and green growth. And then at the same time, we also see the World Glacier Monitoring Services also indicated that there is acceleration in the glacier melting. So we have already seen in our environmental status report. So it was here again we see that the research findings were coming, and the melting rate was doubling with the rate compared to the precedent decade. So the melting was accelerating here. We also find that a group of 20 finance ministers and central bank governance, G20, promised to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Experts' estimates was that annual subsidies could amount to 500 billion, equal to 1% of the world's gross domestic product. So what kind of financial commitments were being made? So we see that happening in 2009. And then in 2009, we also see that 15th session of conference of the COP, 15th session of COP, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was convened in Copenhagen. The domestic targets and actions of large emissions such as of United States and China took the center stage, so that they became the focus. And at the same time in 2009, we see that Philippines experienced the worst tropical typhoon depression on record, and then there was flood. Water levels reached the like 20 feet in rural areas. We also see in 2009 that US joins the statement at UN And 3 months ahead of the target date of new agreement, several world leaders pledged action during UN summit on climate change hosted by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. So the Chinese President Hu Jintao announces a plan to cut emissions by a notable margin by 2020, marking the first time Beijing commits to reducing its rate of greenhouse gas emissions. So that happened. And then Japanese Prime Minister also pledged to reduce the emissions by 25%. And US President Barack Obama, in his first UN address, says the United States is determined to act and lead, but he doesn't offer any new proposal. Also, we see that Ban expresses hope that leaders will reach a substantive deal during the upcoming conference in Copenhagen. So, in December 2009, there was disappointment in Copenhagen. So, really nothing constructive was done. In 2010, we see that uh, temperature target sets in Cancun. The 16th session of COP to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was held in Cancun, there was increased pressure to reach a consensus in the Mexico during COP16 after the failure in Copenhagen. And NASA announcement that 2009 was the warmest decade ever recorded. So there was evidences of global warming. Countries committed to the first time to keep global temperature increase below 2 degree in the Cancun Agreement. So that agreement happened here. So approximately 8 countries, including China, India, and United States, as well as European Union, submitted the emissions reduction targets and actions, and they agreed on the stronger mechanism for monitoring progress. However, there are researches which suggest otherwise. So we also see Green Climate Fund of nearly $100 billion fund was created to assist developing countries in mitigating and adapting to climate change. However, by 2019, only $3 billion so far, where it was committed for $100 billion, $3 billion has been contributed. So further, we see that in 2010, Nagoya Protocol, the purpose of which was to access to genetic resources and a fair and equitable sharing of benefits which arise from the use of Convention on Biological Diversity. So that convention was held, and it agreed to the convention on, it was a supplementary agreement on the biological diversity. In 2011, we see that Ministry of Environment of France reported a very reduced, like only 29% of the average established overall from what was from 1971 to 2000 period, only 29% of rainfall they received, and they also reported that the soils in the northern parts of the country had experienced the driest conditions in last 50 years. So those reports were coming in. And then we see that also there's a Great East Japan earthquake that hit. And then at the same time, we see that by 2011, the population reached 7 billion. So in 2011, we see that there was conference in Durban, South Africa, in which the new accord applied to all countries, and we see that 3 biggest polluters, China, India, and the United States, rejected the accord proposed by the European Union. But they eventually agreed to work towards drafting a new legally binding agreement in 2015 by latest. So the new agreement will differ from the Kyoto Protocol in that it will apply to both developed and developing countries. So in Kyoto Protocol, if you remember, it did not enforce on the developing countries. So the new agreement would apply to both developed and developing countries. With Kyoto Protocol set to expire in few months, the parties agreed to extend it till 2017 at that time. So we see that in 2012, United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development gathered in Rio de Janeiro to mark the 20th anniversary of the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, and the 10th anniversary of the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. It focused on two themes: green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and the institutional framework for sustainable development. So we see that um, there was COP18 in Doha. Negotiators met in Doha, and then they extended Kyoto Protocol until 2020. So, but the remaining participants account for just 15% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So, by this time, Canada has withdrawn from the treaty, and Japan and Russia say that they will not accept new commitments. The United States never signed on. And then the environmental groups criticize countries for not reaching an effective agreement as Typhoon Bopha slams the Philippines, which they say exemplifies a rise in, like, which was an example of how the climate change was happening. So one of the conference successes in Doha amendments, under which developed countries agreed to assist the developing countries mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So what was happening? So the developed countries agreed upon that, and an agreement also sets delegates on the path towards a new treaty. So we further see that in 2013, during the first week of COP19 in Poland, we see that the grouping of developing countries known as the Group of 77, G77, and China propose a new funding mechanism to help vulnerable countries deal with the loss and damage caused by the climate change. So developed countries oppose the mechanism, so that G77 lead negotiators walk out of the conference. So that happened there, and talks eventually resume, and government agreed to make to a mechanism that falls short of what developing countries wanted. So there was no agreement between the developed countries and developing countries. Countries also agree on how to implement and initiate to end deforestation, known as REDD+, but the conference is described by the analysis as the least consequential COP in several years. So there was not any significant output. So we further see in 2015 Paris Agreement, COP21. So the purpose was to address the climate change. The Paris Agreement was legally binding international treaty on climate change, and 196 countries agreed to what experts call the most significant global climate agreement in history. So Paris Agreement happened, and then this was unlike the past accords. It requires nearly all the countries, both developed and developing, to set emissions reduction goals. So all had to come together. However, countries can choose their own targets, and there are no enforcement mechanism to ensure they meet them. So currently there's no enforcement mechanism. So under the agreement, countries are supposed to submit targets known as nationally determined contribution, NDC. So how they would take care of that, and the mission of the Paris Agreement, which entered into force in 2016, to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade and pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5 degree. So in 2016, we see Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, set a universal agenda intended to stimulate social, economic, and environmental action. So many scholars considers environmental protection and sustainable development as the substantive objective of EIA, which currently is to be achieved through the SDGs with 17 integrated goals. So we have 169 targets and 232 indicators. And achieving the SDGs require integrated action on social, environmental, and economic challenges. So all that needs to be worked together. Further, in the same year, we see the Kigali Amendments, with the purpose of which is to reduce the ozone layer depletion. So it amends the 1987 Montreal Protocol, and it aims to reduce the hydrofluorocarbon by roughly 80 to 85% by late 2045. So in 2018, we see that just ahead of COP24 in Katowice, Poland, the new IPCC report came up, which warned about the very devastating consequences, like consequences about stronger storms and dangerous heat waves. So, if the average global temperature rises by 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level, and projects the report projected that it could reach that level by 2030 itself. So, despite the report, countries do not agree to strong targets. So, they are not agreeing to the stronger targets. So, they do, however, largely settle on rules for implementing the Paris Accord, and covering questions including how countries should report their emissions, how they would implement it, and how they would report it. They did not agree on rules for carbon trading, but they pushed the discussion to 2019. So we see later in 2018, we see COP24, of which the core objective of the countries was to agree on the guidelines that govern the Paris Agreement and to create a set of rules to help countries implement their national contribution and meet their targets. So within this, we see that 15 countries signed the Solidarity and Just Transition Celestia Declaration. We see Polish presidency declared a forest for climate policy, highlighting the importance of roles of forest in solving climate problems. So that was done here. In 2019, we see UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres organized UN Climate Action Summit for world leaders in New York. So countries were mandated by the Paris Agreement to submit revised national determined contribution NDCs by the following year. So the meeting to share their ideas on this, and but the leaders of the world top carbon emitting countries, including United States, China, did not attend. So that didn't happen. At the summit, Guterres asked countries to submit plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So we see in 2019, we see COP25. The prime objective of COP 2019 was to finalize the rule book for Paris Agreement. So the Katowice rule book that was outcome of COP24 could not bring resolution to all the issues resulted to global climate change action. So the COP met at 25th meeting at UNFCCC to bring a finalized copy of rule book of Paris Agreement. So in 2019 December, we see COP25 marked the lack of progress of major climate issues, despite like year of warning from the scientists and all the reports coming in, but there was no progress in that. So the issues that were unresolved in COP24 were taken up in COP25, such as carbon market, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, individual targets of the member nations. The discussions and tasks on issues yet again remain unresolved and had to be pushed to COP26. So in April 2020, we see that United Nations postponed COP26, originally scheduled for November 2020 until 2021 because of the pandemic. And then countries were expected to strengthen their emissions reductions goals set under the Paris Agreement at the conference in Glasgow. So, in July 2021, we see that more than 100 countries are altogether accounting for nearly 60% of Paris Agreement signatories met the deadline to submit updated NDCs ahead of COP26 in November. So, we see that the purpose of this COP26 was to bring together the world's leaders to act together to limit temperature rises and commit to more ambitious targets, and then reducing the greenhouse gas emission by 2030, and discuss measures to adapt the inevitable impact of climate change. So, more than 100 countries altogether accounted for nearly 60% of Paris Agreement signatories met the deadline to submit updated NDCs ahead of COP26 in November 2021. So, some of the top emitters propose more ambitious targets. So, President Joe Biden announces that United States will aim to cut its emission roughly half of its 2005 level by 2030, doubling President Obama's commitment. And then we see that China and India are responsible for roughly 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emission in 2019, missed the deadline. And then we also see the IPCC report 2021. It further predicts that the world will reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within the next 2 decades, even if nations drastically cuts emissions immediately. So that's what we see. And we see it in November 2021 that COP26 President Alok Sharma says commitments made during the conference keeps the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degree alive, but it's very weak. There's some progress, but it's very weak. So that is what we are at this stage. That is what we have arrived at now as a nation and as the global context. So here we are ending the timeline which we had seen, like how the world is moving in terms of environmental considerations, in the political agreement, international agreement, and then kind of awareness which is coming and kind of concerns which are coming. So summarizing, we saw the initiatives and events with the from the global environmental perspective from 2000 to 2021. From the previous lecture, we started from 1970 to 2021. So you may reflect and think how our EIA addresses to the larger goals and larger problems, how much it can really address to. So we'll be further looking into law and policy and institutional setup in our next lecture. So these were our references for this particular session, and these are the suggested watch and read. And please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about any concerns you have. Do share your opinions, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring AIA. Thank you.